them into our lives. Somebody puts it this way, what we need to do perhaps is we need to bring our grills into the front yard. Not literally, but what it means is we need to be inviting the family next door and begin this relationship, the hi and hello and what's going on and this interaction so that we can build this relationship and let them begin observing us. Christ shines the brightest in the ordinary parts of our lives, and following Jesus demands relational interaction. And that's what happened to the disciples, to these first few. Jesus introduced them to himself, to his ministry, and finally to his mission before them. Now, there's one thing also here that we must remember. Jesus was never in a hurry. He was never in a hurry to bring the person to a moment of praying a prayer. Simply give that person time to really see him and get to know him. In fact, when you look at the disciples, and this takes us to the second invite of Jesus, that about 16 or 18 months later, after that initial encounter with James and Andrew, and then some more started following him, they would serve him. They were there during the first miracle that he did in the wedding. They were there. They've seen Jesus with his anger in the temple. And then about 16 or 18 months later, after that initial encounter, Jesus released them back to their known world. And they must have been talking about and reflecting back on those times, on those days, those weeks, those interaction with Jesus. Until one day Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee in Matthew chapter 4, and that's, if you could move your Bibles to the passage, Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 to 22. It says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and followed him, and going on from there, he saw two other brothers, verse 21, James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And he called them. Immediately they left their boat, and they followed him. One of the key words here that describes the way they started following Jesus at this point, at this stage, is that word immediately. Why? Because they, to some degree, have come to know who this man is. And so when Jesus invited them to follow, they have already been reflecting. They knew the life that they had lived with him this past weeks and months. And they knew and what the expectation would be with the kind of life that they're going to live. But what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus? In this invitation, Jesus calls them to a new level of commitment. And we find this invitation in several places in the Gospels. Actually, there are about 22 of them in different forms where Jesus told someone in one way or another, follow me. What does it mean? Now, let me just put it this way. Following Jesus involves or implies or it means movement. We cannot be following without moving because Jesus is always on the move. So it implies movement. And that is the implication of the word. It implies change. It implies constant moving and changing. To move means to change one's location. When Jesus said, follow me, he expects the hearer to respond. And we respond by following. We follow, we move from one point forward or from point A to point B. Think of salvation this way, that when Jesus invited us into that relationship with him, He called us from something into something. I mean, salvation is about being rescued. But we're not just been rescued and then Jesus said, okay, you wait, when you die, you'll have a spot in heaven. No, Jesus rescued you for a purpose. Jesus saved you from something unto something. Jesus saved me from the kingdom of darkness to Christ's kingdom of light, from the children of wrath to becoming the children of God, from living for oneself to living for someone else, and that someone else is Christ and the people that Christ died for. From a wasted life to a purposeful life. A PowerPoint here that I want to show you a picture of kind of the process of what the life of a believer is. It begins with death, of course. And when we were born again, that's when life began. And we were spiritual infant, becoming a spiritual toddler, spiritual child, into spiritual adolescence and spiritual early adulthood. But the point is that it is a constant movement, it's constant change, and the goal is for us to become reproducers, making more disciples, and not simply producing more disciples of Christ, but producing more disciple makers like us that is going to reproduce more. That's what Jesus did here on earth. But the way he did it, he simply invested his life in a few. That's what I want to see here as well. We don't have to go out every morning and talk to every person and tell them about how they're lost. We simply have to invest our life in a few who is going to do the same thing we're doing, a few at a time. Their calling was completely clear. They were not confused about what Jesus was asking them. They knew what they were getting into. They have compared their lives before and what their lives will be. And they knew this is the kind of life they wanted to live. That lasted for about 6 months. Most Bible scholars, those who study the Gospels, and as they walk us through this, and then about 6 months later, so this would be about 2 years down the road from the moment that Jesus began his ministry, we get to the third phase, or the third invite that Jesus extended to the disciple. When you look at Luke, a passage like Luke chapter 6, verse 12 and 13, it says, during those days he went out to the mountain to pray and spent the whole night prayer. And when morning came, he called or summoned his disciples, and he chose 12 among them, whom he also named. My favorite passage regarding this is found in Mark 3, 13 and 14, or until 15. And the same thing, says Jesus went up the mountain the whole night and then prayed. And then summoned those that he wanted, and they came to him. But this is what I like. He said, he's appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him. Takes them to another level. From come and see, follow me, to now he said, I really want to spend more time with you. Be with me. And from this time on, Jesus would spend about 90% of his time with the 12, especially with 3 of the 12. Peter, James, and John. In fact, when you read through the Gospels, you realize that there are few moments where special moments in the life of Jesus, like the Transfiguration, where he invited only 3. Only Peter, James, and John. They would play a significant role when he would go back to heaven in the leadership of the apostles and in the planting and the building of his church and the progression of the mission of redemption. But the principle here is it is more effective to invest our time and lives in a few who are going to do the same thing we're doing. And I'll try to show you that in the last slide that we'll have this morning. But this is critical. This is a time when Jesus invites them to be with him, to really have that life-on-life relationship with him, because as he would tell us in Mark chapter 3, when invited and appointed 12, it says, so that they would be with him, so that he could send them out to preach. Before we can speak for him, first we must be with him. Now, of course, Jesus isn't here today. We can come to where he is and be with him. But this is basically what happens when he invited his men. They were to do the same thing. We are also to do the same thing. I often ask this question: who are you accountable to, and who is accountable to you? In other words, we must always be in a link of this progression where we ask someone to mentor us and help us and disciple us and grow us in Christ, as we help someone else and disciple them to become a follower of Christ as well. We must be with him before we can speak to him. He chose only those he wanted. Many were disappointed at this time that they weren't selected. But this doesn't mean that others will not get through the third stage. It simply means that not everyone will grow in the same pace and the same speed. But we observe those that we can invest, or what the gospel is, what Jesus would say, the fourth soil, and invest in them, because they are going to be reproducing soon. Jesus focused on a few, because Jesus focused on a few because that was the only way to transplant his heart into the lives of his key followers. Internalization cannot happen through mass transference to an audience, but must happen in an interpersonal environment. Robert Coleman said this. There's another quote here. Said, Robert Coleman is one of the most respected authorities in evangelism and discipleship. He said, the best work is always done with a few. Better to give a year or so to one or two men or one or two women who learn what it means to conquer for Christ than to spend a lifetime with a congregation just keeping the program going. And this was the story of the 12. It all started in a boat and went out to the world. And what happened was they radically recentered everything in their lives around Jesus, his teachings, and his mission, because they had been with him. In fact, this was what was said of the disciples in the book of Acts, when it says they turned the word upside down. They said, this man, and these were by the critics of Jesus, this man must have been with him. And yes, they had been with him. If we have been with Jesus, and Jesus today represents that probably small group that is being mentored as well, growing in Christ, that we allow that we allow to live with us life on life. They become the instrument that God uses in his hands to shape us so that we become like Christ. Somebody said that ministry happens in four spaces: in public space, in social space, and our personal space, and the intimate space. And Jesus spent his time as well in this. In public space, there was Jesus with the crowd. He would heal. We would feed the thousands. But he would spend time as well with the 70, and then much of his time with the 12, and 90% of his time, especially when they reached the peak of his ministry with them, he would spend almost all his time with his 12 and with Peter, James, and John, because internalization happens only in the intimate space. And this explains why we need to be in a group of 3, 4, or 5, I would say maximum 5, where we allow those lives to rub with our lives So the percentage of retention of information is higher in the intimate space or stage. No? Learning here is not through a classroom, but hands-on and through modeling. And this is where we will know others and be known by others. This is where we will love others and be loved by others. This is where we serve others and be served by others. And where we celebrate others and be celebrated as well with us. This is where we practice accountability to each other. Accountability will not happen unless there is relationship. And relationship requires proximity, closeness. Proximity will create tensions, but tensions are